I have the privilege now of introducing to you Jan Patterson and Ann Bliss. I'm not going to run through their bios. We're all people that can read, and apart from that, they've got a lot to talk to us about. Their bios are in the documents that you've received today. But what I will say is that Jan is she was the chair of the Parental Engagement Project Task Force that produced the documentation and the resources that we're going to be spoken to about here today. And Anne was a member of that task force. Can I say the documentation that came out of that work, I believe, is second to none that I've seen in relation to providing insight into to working with parents and engaging them in parental engagement within their school environment and within the broader context of the community as well. But here I am talking on, and I'm taking up their time, so I'll call on Jan and Anne to undertake the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. And I might say Anne and I feel very privileged to be able to speak to you today about the project and about the task force. I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners of the land, and to thank Auntie Janet for welcoming us here today. I'd also like to say that Anne and I are speaking on our own behalf and as members of our task force rather than the organisations that actually employ us. For Anne, that's the South Australian Federation of Catholic School Parent Communities. For myself, that's the South Australian Smarter Schools National Partnerships Secretariat. So you can see, if you like, I'm the bureaucrat or the government partner, and Anne is the parent partner in this presentation. First, we've already had a bit of a discussion about what we're talking about in relation to engagement and involvement and what that means. And also I'd just like to comment, throughout our presentation, we're using a bit interchangeably the terms parent, family and community. And we realise that these are different and that you may need to think about strategies in slightly different ways, particularly in relation to community involvement or community engagement in relation to schooling. So if you'll just forgive us if we use those terms interchangeably for the time being. In relation to involvement and influence, which we believe is all about engagement, there are a whole range of different levels, and we like to think of that as a continuum, with all of the continuum being important. What we really need to think about is how we can maximise that impact of the involvement of parents, of the engagement of parents. And to pick up on Anne's terminology, we need to think about from the Cubby House to Canberra and from Canberra to the Cubby House. It goes both ways. It isn't just a one-way conversation that needs to happen. And for those of you who are Canberrians, please excuse us. We do realise that Canberra is a lot more than just the federal government, but let's face it, this is the seat of power in Australia. The focus of our presentation is actually going to be on systems and policies. So while we realise the different levels, for this presentation we will be focusing on the systems and policies. The sectors, organisations that are involved, rather than what's happening at the specific school level. We don't profess to have all the answers, but we'll be drawing on the work of the national project and other work in this area. And so we'd really like to focus on the whole notion that strong family and community engagement is central to effective school reform. And I'd also like to say that there are a number of other members of the task force here at the symposium, so please feel free to talk to them about the work of the project as well. We hope that what we've got to say will stimulate reflection, discussion and debate over the next 2 days of the symposium. First of all, I'd just like to present a little bit of the context. As Minister Garrett mentioned, this project was in the context of the Smarter Schools National Partnerships. The project title was Parental Engagement in Schooling in Low Socioeconomic Status School Communities. The context for the Smarter Schools National Partnerships is actually the COAG reform agenda. For those of you who don't know about COAG, it's the Council of Australian Governments, and that's very much about increasing productivity through raising the overall educational outcomes of all Australian students. The Smarter Schools National Partnerships were signed in 2008. Planning and implementation really commenced from 2009, and it brought in $2.5 billion of new funding into education across jurisdictions and sectors around Australia. It was actually part of the original stimulus package that most of us, I think, have already forgotten about. Its focus was on improving teacher quality, supporting school communities experiencing disadvantage, and improving literacy and numeracy outcomes for students. One of the things that was nested under the national partnerships was what were called originally 6 key collaborative projects, but then came to be known as the 6 key reform projects, and you can see the list of what those projects are. The idea of the projects was that they would support jurisdictions in the implementation of the Smarter Schools National Partnerships reforms. These projects were funded by the Australian Government through the Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations, and we're very grateful for that funding. But I'd also like to note that in fact for all of the projects, but particularly for this project, there was significant in-kind contribution that was made through sectors, jurisdictions and organisations in participating in the workshops, through the working groups, through the case studies, and that comes back to time that was given by school principals and school staff to participate in the case study research and other activities that were part of these. One of the things I'd just like to talk to in relation to our own experience in the project was about working collaboratively across jurisdictions, sectors and organisations. And we all talk about this and we all know that it's critical, but in fact how we go about it and the time that we need to do it is really important. For us, there were a number of challenges in doing this. Our task force comprised people from education authorities and people from parent organisations as well. One of the things that we really needed to do right in the beginning was to think about the different perspectives and expectations. And as you'll probably appreciate, that different states and territories and different sectors are at different points in their understanding and how they consider and how they think about and support parental engagement. As well as that, we had to consider the different demographics and geographics of Australia. So what might work in a capital city may not work in a regional area and may not work for Indigenous communities, and so we needed to be mindful of that diversity of need. We needed to think about the different expectations and what we could really achieve through the project. And most importantly, we needed to listen to each other's perspectives and develop a shared understanding of what parental engagement was about, what the message was that we wanted to send out as a result of this project. And we needed to develop various strategies to work together. Those from the parent organisations needed to be mindful of the laborious bureaucratic processes that those within government or often within sectors and systems have to deal with. As well as that, we needed to acknowledge the contribution and the perspective that parent organisations bring that is very different or can be quite different to how it's often portrayed or perceived within government. And so you can see from what I've said on the slide there about where we put our emphasis in working collaboratively together. And it did actually take a significant time commitment to do that. As a result, as both the Minister mentioned and Peter has mentioned, there have been a number of outcomes from the project. You'll hear about some of the resources and about the case studies through the workshops that are following on from this presentation this morning. You'll probably be aware that there have been a series of promotional activities within jurisdictions and sectors about what's come out of the project, and that's largely been task force members taking it upon themselves to really promote what has happened. And the final thing from the project was the report that is in the process of being presented to the Standing Council for School Education and Early Childhood. And I'm sure most of you are aware that the Standing Council is a new name for the Ministerial Council on Education and Child Development and Youth Affairs, and the various name changes that it's had over the years. So we look forward to that. Just to touch on the educational reform in Australia and the context about what we're talking about. The current educational reform and policy context, as I think Kaz just mentioned, is very much about improving educational outcomes. And we'd also like to suggest that why parental engagement is important is also about improving educational outcomes. We've got a synergy there in terms of both the educational reform context and in its broadest consideration, as well as our discussion here in thinking about parental engagement. Helene touched on some of the research around why parental engagement is important and the influence that it can have on educational outcomes, so I won't go into that in any more detail now. And I also understand in relation to the Australian context, we'll be hearing a bit more about the research tomorrow through the work that ARACI is doing. And so that leads me to the first key message that I've got for you is that a systemic, integrated approach to embedding parent and family engagement in education policies, structures and practices across Australia will contribute to improving student outcomes. We're not saying that we don't think there's a debate anymore about that it may or it might. We're saying that it will contribute to improving student outcomes. You've just had quite a long period of time sitting, listening, and what I'd like you to do for the next couple of minutes is talk to the person behind you or the person sitting next to you or in front of you about what you think might be some of the opportunities that exist in the current education reform context for progressing such a systemic integrated approach. So what immediately comes to mind as we've been thinking about the Australian context, what immediately comes to mind? So if you'd just like to take a few minutes, you can stand up and just limber up a little bit, but just talk to whoever's around you. We're really only talking a couple of minutes because we've got a lot of other things to say, but introduce yourselves and just reflect on that for a minute. I thought that might be okay.
That was great, Jan.
I've got the drink on the far side.
Okay.
I forgot to set this, of course.
No, that's all right. We're never going to do that. You always wonder what's actually being said.
It's just really a
Yeah,
for people
to stretch. Gather, yeah.
If you like, do you want me
Yeah.
we did say that it was only a couple of minutes, so I'm sorry you need to sit down again and we'll continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. The energy and the noise suggests that this is an area of great passion and interest. Of course it is. That's why we're all here. We're here at a time of, in the midst of a bold education reform agenda here in Australia. And Jan's just set you the task to reflect on our own Australian context as we talk about the issue of parental engagement in education and its direct relationship with improving student learning outcomes for our young people in this country. I'm sure in your reflections and in your brief chat there, you would have considered a number of elements of this bold education reform agenda. We're going to take some time to just consider a few of those today in this context. And of course, press the wrong button. Okay. Without a doubt, we have the Melbourne Declaration on Educational Goals for Young Australia, in essence the foundational document for guiding and driving this bold education reform agenda. It's clear within this document that the importance of parents and families in education is clear. There are many areas within the Melbourne Declaration that call for a commitment to action. It's one of my favourite parts of the Declaration, a statement about what are we committing to as a country in relation to the educational goals for young people. I'd like to take some time at this point to reflect on that commitment to action and just think about the action that has taken place over the last few years. If you look at some of the dot points under there, we've got things like strengthening accountability and transparency. Without a doubt, we have My School now and ACARA managing that, and we now have an opportunity to have direct link to information and data around our schools and around educational outcomes within our schools. Lots of energy, lots of resourcing that's gone into that. We had a goal around improving educational outcomes for Indigenous youth, disadvantaged young Australians and students from low SES backgrounds. And of course we know about the Smarter Schools National Partnership Project, the Low SES Project, our Indigenous national partnerships. There's been quite a considerable amount of resource and energy into that. This is great. This is absolutely essential as part of this overall approach. We can talk about the strengthening early childhood education, supporting quality teacher and school leadership, other areas in that commitment to action. Well-resourced, well-supported, and lots of outcome and action that has occurred with that. There's also a commitment of action to developing stronger partnerships. And in the context of this bold education reform agenda, yes, we've had inroads in that area, the development of our bureau, the funding for this project that we're talking about today. Incredibly important and necessary elements of this commitment to action, but I'd challenge the relative investment made against each of these commitments to action in this Melbourne Declaration. And there's still a considerable way to go to continue to invest in the importance of parental engagement in education. Teacher equality is a significant component of the education reform agenda, and rightly so. But our question today is, in this agenda, we've had the development of national professional standards for teachers, national professional standards for principals. We're looking at the nationally consistent accreditation of pre-service teacher education programs. We know within each of those there is a connection with the importance of the working relationship between teachers and parents, the role that the principals have in leading our learning communities. Our question is, how is parent and family engagement understood and translated into practice to move and shift these standards and these the components and elements within these standards into real action and real change? I think it's important within the whole context of teacher equality to continue to reflect on the core professional relationship that teachers must have with parents. It is core to professional practice. And whilst we are embedding and talking about their relationship with parents in the standards, how are we translating that into action and supporting and building the capacity of teachers to do that? We talk about a recent university study at Monash University where 82% of teachers indicated that they had a need for ongoing professional development in the area of working with parents and families. 82% of respondents. That's an exceptional need out there in our teaching community for addressing their capacity to invite engagement with parents and work in partnership with parents. We know that the school principal is the single most important factor in achieving best practice in family school partnership. We know that teachers must begin to engage with and benefit from active involvement in parents as a core part of their professional practice. So how, at a government system and policy level, are we supporting the building of capacity of teachers in this area? And I think that's an area for ongoing work in this agenda. Of course, we have the Gonski Review. And it's to great delight to parent bodies like ACSO and APC who contributed considerably to the review of the funding for schooling in Australia, that the importance of parental engagement is mentioned throughout the report. It gives us a great opportunity to progress this agenda when we hear the comments made within the report about the absolute importance of the engagement of parents in student learning as we endeavour to improve student learning outcomes. We have recommendation 7 actually highlighting that the input about increased funding to overcome disadvantage and the importance of directing that funding to building parent and community engagement. We have finding 24, which again highlights the importance of engaging families in student learning. A seminal document in this whole education reform agenda, pointing out specifically the absolute importance of engaging parents and families in student learning. It is an incredible policy lever that we have here. How are we progressing that? How can we use this opportunity to advance parent and family engagement in education into the future? So our key message here is clear. We all need to work to create an environment where parental engagement is seen as an integral part of the ongoing education reform agenda. We, in this context, government departments, government agencies, peak parent bodies, sectors, jurisdictions, bodies like AETSL, pre-service teacher education training providers, everyone. There are key stakeholders and key players to progress this agenda at a significant policy level. Remembering this reform agenda calls for equity and quality in educational outcomes for every child, to realise their potential. We cannot, we need to keep making the connection between the engagements of parents and families and improved educational outcomes. It is no longer an add-on or a periphery issue in education. It is an integral issue in education, a non-negotiable. So we know the rhetoric, we know the theory, we get it, people talk about it, it's embedded in these documents that are driving our education reform agenda. I believe our key challenge is to move from that rhetoric to the everyday culture and practice. And Alain, you mentioned the work in Ontario on doing that, and we're talking today about our Australian context and the opportunities to progress this agenda. It's clear from the outcomes of the Parental Engagement Project that you will hear more about later on through the case study workshop and of course the toolkit workshop. And in all other work around this area in education, there are clear themes that emerge about what's important in moving from the rhetoric to the reality, from rhetoric to action. They are about culture, shared aspirations and goals, an enabling environment, the collaborative working relationships that are essential, the capacity that needs to be built amongst educators and parents and families and communities, and of course resourcing. And we're going to move on to talk about each of those in more detail. But I guess it's important as an opening statement about this that I think one of the key elements of shifting from rhetoric to culture is for us as a society, as educators and as parents, to really reflect on the rhetoric of parents as first and continuing educators and parents as partners. What does that really mean? Do we really believe that? Do we really respect that? As educators, do we believe and respect that and move into our role as educators with that underpinning principle? As parents, do we feel empowered enough and enabled enough to actually live out that role and that responsibility as first educators and as partners in education? As Alma Harris states, do we know we matter in this whole education agenda? Parental engagement in education is not just a cliche rolled out to appease the peak parent groups or to sound good in our mission statements. It's actually action that needs to take place. So I pass on to Jan to continue that conversation with you.
I think Elaine raised the question about has education and educators and the education system looked within itself about how they consider the involvement of parents and the engagement of parents. And we also need to ask that at a community level as well, as to what does community believe about the role of parents in their children's education and the role of parents in schooling. Through the project, there were three things that really encapsulated what we needed to do in thinking about changing some of the culture within education. The first thing was about increasing knowledge of benefits of parental and family engagement to educational outcomes. I think it's very common knowledge that we all know that it's a good idea if parents can help out in schools, and that will could potentially make the school a happier place for students. But the relationship with educational outcomes, I think, has been less clearly communicated, both to educators, to parents, and more broadly within the community. And so we really need to build on that connection and make sure that people do understand the connection and some of the things about what parents can do and what parents need to understand. For example, the example that was given about talking to children and how important that is, about what educators need to do and understand about that. So the whole issue of whether we actually need a social marketing type campaign that promotes the importance of parental engagement in learning and schooling. It's also about increasing the value placed on parental and family engagement as central to the educational improvement and reform agenda. And that's both at a school level as well as at a policy and systems level. So how are the key parent groups being involved in the educational reform conversations? What voice have they got? How do we move it from very much being a periphery or an add-on or a one-off consultation to being there right in the heart of those discussions? And it's very much about the emphasis on partnerships. We talked about shared aspirations and goals as being important for the task force, but it's also important in relation to that endeavour. And I think that we're all clear about the need or the understanding that we have share a high aspiration for all students, and a commitment that educational achievement is for all students, and that we shouldn't really be expecting that students in Australia or young people in Australia are leaving school without the necessary skills and educational achievement to be able to lead a productive and full life. We all know about the importance of schooling to future life outcomes. The research is very clear in relation to the impact on health outcomes, in relation to employment outcomes. That's why, as a community, we all invest in schooling. We invest in it as a public good. We know the significant amount of dollars that ours, as all of us as taxpayers, go in to education. And so we really need to ensure that as a society we actually get the maximum benefit for all children from that investment and system. The other thing we need to do is to strengthen the evidence base here in Australia. We have drawn a lot on overseas research. We're beginning and building on some of the early research here in Australia, but we really need to contextualise it to Australia, and we need to build that research agenda. We also need to look to other disciplines to help support building that agenda. Disciplines who are interested in the family, interested in how families work, who often see the school as a site for their research and will come knocking on principals' doors and saying, can we have access to your students and your families as a way in for them to do their research. We need to be asking them, hey, as part of your research, we need you to be thinking about how it can contribute to the education research, and the whole emphasis on parental engagement and the importance of parental engagement in relation to the research. And that brings me to the third key message that we have for you, and that's about the value and contribution of parental and family engagement in learning and schooling to improving Australian students' educational outcomes must be more strongly and widely promoted within education and in the community. And sometimes it seems that it's the best kept secret that we've got for actually raising student educational achievements. The next point we'd like to make is about enabling environments. And again, I think it's already been touched on today. It's not going to happen if it's just left to chance and a piecemeal approach is adopted. It's going to be too slow and often covering the same ground. And I know that sometimes there's a frustration. There will be people in this audience today who've had these conversations already a number of times, many times over many years. And so there's that frustration about having to go over the same ground. But we do need to really make sure that we do use the opportunity that we've got now. The steps that are needed to be used both within the current planning and improvement frameworks, within systems and within sectors and within schools, we need to capitalise on that so that parental engagement isn't just an add-on, as one of the questions alluded to, the number of lists that seem to be abounding about what schools must and mustn't do, but for parental engagement to be embedded as part of that improvement cycle, not just as an add-on, but as something that is done on an everyday basis. We need to be thinking about multiple ways, and we also need to be thinking about the importance of school leadership, and as Anne mentioned, about it being a core competency of teaching practice and enabling teachers to be able to effectively work with parents. In relation to collaborative working relationships, we do need to put the time and effort into developing these. We generally know what it means at a school level, and some schools are excellent at doing this, and other schools have some ways to go. But at a government and systems level, I think we are less able and really have to spend more time and resources and commit more resources to enabling that to happen. And so that leads me to our fourth key message, and that's about strong working partnerships, because we're not going to be able to do this as government alone or as education alone or as parents alone. It's got to be done as a collaborative, strong working partnership that is built on mutual respect and trust between parents, families and those working in education systems. And to be ensuring that we're conveying the message that this will result in more effective school improvement and reform. Again, it isn't just that it may or it might, but that we go into these partnerships with the firm belief that it will result in more effective school improvement and reform. And I'm going to hand back to Anne to cover the last couple of points we want to make.
Thank you, Jan. We've touched on this throughout the presentation, but certainly it's the building of capacity in both educators and parents and community for engaging in student learning and engaging in the life of our school communities is probably a key element for shifting from rhetoric to action in education in Australia. We need support to develop the necessary knowledge and skills. Whilst embedded in standards now, both at the teacher level and principal level, how do we then build the capacity within educators and school leaders to actively invite parent and family engagement in student learning? And so there are, if we're thinking about the focus of this symposium and our presentation today at the government, to the system, the sector and jurisdictional level and peak body level, there are opportunities to create collaborative working relationships, let's say between the Bureau and AITS, or with regard to the development of PD for teachers and for school leaders and so on. We have a great opportunity now with the nationally accredited pre-service teacher education and also about the standards for graduate teachers to ensure that the training that our pre-service teachers are receiving, both in theory and in practicum, creates incredibly rich opportunities for them to build the skills required to engage effectively with parents and families. Is it right that if after a 4-year degree a teacher leaves and has had no practical experience of talking with a parent, collaborating with a parent, jointly planning with a parent? I don't think so. Is it right that a first experience for early careers teacher in a parent-teacher conversation is unsupported and unplanned? I don't think it is. It's an area of professional practice that is as integral as being able to teach literacy and numeracy. So how do we ensure that that's addressed at the pre-service teacher training level and ongoing PD for teachers? Similarly, for parents. For both parents and educators, this engagement thing does not necessarily come naturally. It's not intuitive, and it should, as Jan said, not be left to chance. We need to be looking at the opportunities to create and build the capacity of parents to engage in their children's learning, to re-empower parents that it is integral to our role and that we are the first and continuing educators. Is it right as a society that we say to families, when children are 5, they start school and they go to school to learn to read and write? That comment alone disempowers us as the first and continuing educators, and it says to us, okay, hand it over. It's over to us now. We have to re-empower families as the first and continuing educators and build our capacity to be the best support we can for our children's learning. So how do we create the opportunities at all of those levels of influence and impact to build the capacity? The relationship and the working relationship between parents and teachers is the most potentially powerful working relationship in education. To tap into the potential of parents as partners in education will create enormous opportunities for us within our government, within sectors, within schools, within classrooms. We bring to this partnership Educators bring a professional expertise to the partnership. As parents, we bring our knowledge, our skills and experiences of our children. It is an equitable partnership. We're each bringing particular skills. How do we enhance that and for the benefit of our students and their learning? I think it's incredibly powerful and the opportunities are important. So we talk about what training's required, induction's required, the services and resources and modelling and PD that's required to build this capacity across both key partners in this. And so that leads on, I guess, quite nicely to a segue about the fifth area of enabling, to shift from rhetoric to reality in our education sectors is what are the resources that are required to enable effective family and community engagement in education in Australia. Of course it means increasing dollars. It means increasing resources to enable this, to provide the sufficient services for all the key players to enable parent engagement in learning. It's a responsibility for governments, for departments, for sectors, for school leaders and for parents and for families. In many of our schools now we have examples of funding being directed to employ community liaison officers. In many cases this is left to chance. It's left to the local decision making as to where the money will be directed. Remembering too, it's not just about the amount of money, it's how the funding that we receive is directed to ensure that this important integral area of education is supported. It's not only about the amount of funding and the resources, but also about increasing the awareness of the resources that are already available. There are an enormous amount of resources available to schools, to sectors, to families, to teachers around engaging parents in education. We've got to commit to promoting that, enabling that and supporting schools to do that. It takes funds, it takes resources, it takes a sustained and embedded commitment to do this. So this is a huge challenge and one that can't be left to chance also. So our fifth key message. Let's call this for what it is. We know parental engagement is integral to student learning outcome. It's integral part, it's core to this education reform agenda we are all committed to. But the capacity and resourcing available to it must reflect that rhetorical value being placed on this key area of education. We have to provide a sound investment in this area in education because we know the return for that investment is absolutely enormous. We need to be able to support that through effective resourcing. We have the evidence to support it. We have the effective strategies that enable it. It's about resourcing. Parents are not a majority group in education. We are a key player, we're significant stakeholders and a potential to be realised. It takes more than random piecemeal acts and token gestures to realise this potential. So in summary, our key messages, as you see here, a systemic, integrated approach, considering parental engagement as an integral part of the ongoing education reform agenda, promoting the value and the connection between parental engagement and student learning, the strong working relationships and collaborations across all levels of that continuum of influence and impact, and the importance of building capacity and adequate resourcing to reflect the rhetorical value of this important area of education. So we're all here from different parts of this continuum. We're here from government, we're here from government departments, we're here from key peak agencies, peak bodies, we're here from schools, we're here from homes. So consider, we'd like you to leave you with this final message. Each and every one of you has your own particular sphere of influence in this agenda. We'd like you to consider throughout the rest of this symposium, what is your role? What's your particular role in the particular area that you work in and the particular sphere of influence you have in driving forward this agenda? And we hope that you consider that and look through that lens as you hear and listen to throughout the rest of the symposium. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. I'm Jane from the ACT P&C Council. And I have something a little tangential perhaps, but triggered by your comment, Anne, about it shouldn't be the first time a new teacher speaks to a parent as the first parent-teacher interview at a school, etc. It just got me thinking back to preschool, not pre-schools, but way before school. We have a growing, ever-growing emphasis on childcare centres now becoming educational institutions and
Further
bragging about
disempowering
it.
parents.
Yes, what engagement has been undertaken with that side of now what will start to be termed educators, and because we're talking about let's do it right at the outset. Let's make it a culture of expectancy in parents that they will be engaged every step of the way.
Yes. I think that's a really important point, because if we're talking about systemically disempowering parents over time, we don't want to continue to do that further down the chain from birth onwards. I think it's about continuing to emphasise the importance of the partnership. Don Edgar says the role of a school, the purpose of a school is to support the family, to educate the child. I think if we take that shift back and remember that that's what schools, education providers, and in this context, early learning centres, childcare centres, these are services that are existing to support the primary role of parents to educate our children. So I think it's about the language we use, it's about the messages we send out to the community. It's a very comprehensive approach to continuing that message. But I think there are probably other presentations throughout the symposium where we'll have a focus on the early years and the work that's being done in engaging families and maintaining the engagement of families as first and continuing educators there.
Yes, I think there's a presentation tomorrow by Katerina, I can't quite see her in the audience, about the project relating to parental engagement in the early years as well.
And hippie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, my name's Lindy Reid. I'm from Tasmania,
Hi, Lindy.
up there on the beautiful northwest coast in Devonport. We're very fortunate in Tassie to actually have Launching into Learning, which is a LILS program. It starts in early childhood. And it's basically a program, a preschool program where parents come with their children. And some of the children are actually babies. It's a 0 to 4 program. So I think that's the way to really empower parents. And I do believe they just said that it's been launched in every school now, I think in Tasmania. So that's another way of empowering parents to get them in at the start, that you can come along in the 0 to 4 program and be actively engaged at that stage. And I think that's a really good thing to be happening here in Tassie.
Yes, and we could probably in each of our states and territories be able to identify projects similar to that. I guess part of this is about how do we systematically ensure that these kind of projects become embedded as core practice and not reliant on sort of, to use Weiss's terminology, random acts or whatever. I think core to this whole message is just continuing to say to parents, you are already doing so much within your day-to-day interaction and care and parenting and nurturing of your child. This is about supporting that, not about taking over from that, but supporting that.